spirituality in Canada. So I will begin by explaining this metaphor of the mosaic as something that is ingrained into our perceptions as Canadians from a very young age. It is the way in which we tell our national narrative to ourselves and to others. This mosaic suggests a form of multiculturalism wherein different peoples can retain their specific cultural identities while joining together in coexistence. Since the 20th century, Canada has been one of the world's major immigrant-receiving societies, and the view of Canada as a mosaic of cultures became the basis for Pierre Trudeau's government multiculturalism policies in the early 1970s. The Canadian government established the official Multiculturalism Act in 1971, subsequently followed by a Minister for Multiculturalism in 1972, a Canadian Multiculturalism Council in 1973, along with a multiculturalism branch within the Department of the Secretary of State. I'll begin to position myself within this theoretical framework by declaring that I would not be here today without these multicultural policies. My mother immigrated with her family from Hong Kong and met my father of British descent in Vancouver, British Columbia. Topics of colonization were not exactly things that we discussed around the dinner table, but I knew that while I clearly benefited from the cultural mosaic narrative, the story could not be so simple for everyone. It was not until high school and into university that I began to understand my own identity within the context of the state of Canada's fragmented relationship with Indigenous peoples. And with that, I began to consider how fragile this national narrative truly is, and how this has had and continues to have severe repercussions for reconciliation that affects all those who live in the Canadian state.
So myself, I'm an Indigenous person, part of the Anishinaabe Nation, and a member of Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation in Ontario, Canada, which is a reserve, a First Nations reserve, or an Indian reserve, maybe. So I, however, grew up off reserve in a city in southern Ontario, but my worldview as a development student has been informed by both my lived experience as an Indigenous person, as well as my formal background in Western academic institutions. As we'll discuss later in this presentation, learning and living my Indigenous culture has not been straightforward. My grandmother was removed from her home on our traditional lands and taken to a residential school where she could not speak our traditional language, engage in our culture, or spiritual practices. This has had a profound effect on generation-to-generation transmission of Indigenous knowledge and spirituality in my family, as well as in the families of over 150,000 Indigenous children that were taken from their homes.
So Sarah and I are in our first year of the MDP program, and one of our required courses is called Indigenous Thought and Worldviews, Sustainable Understandings. With the advent of the new Sustainable Development Goals, we have spent this course exploring why the prioritization of sustainability should come hand in hand with the prioritization of Indigenous knowledge, and without undermining Indigenous spirituality along the way. Isolating these ideas is not only counterproductive, but does a disservice to Indigenous peoples through the perpetuation of a collective amnesia that disregards the way in which colonization has attacked and silenced Indigenous knowledge and spiritual understandings of the world. In our course, we learned that the spiritual understanding is grounded in the concept of all my relations, referring to the significance of relationships that go beyond human interaction into mutual interactions with the land, all other beings on the land, and further, all ancestors and relations in the spirit world as well as the Creator. This deep respect for relationships likewise forms the basis for Indigenous understandings of living sustainably and form the Indigenous best practice for assessing scarcity. We are additionally offered the space to participate in traditional Indigenous practices such as sweat lodges and Sundance singing. And when considering this in a vacuum, it would seem that Canada's multicultural narrative has been an effective measure for promoting intercultural harmony and cultural revitalization. What we are here to argue, however, is that our program is not reflective of the dominant political climate of Canada, which continues to dismiss the colonial legacy and its impacts on Indigenous spirituality, and thus any meaningful progress towards reconciliation. Over the course of our presentation, we will root one of the most controversial issues about immigration in the recent Canadian federal election within the colonial legacy of settlement to offer a more comprehensive picture about the ways that multicultural ideals have evolved into their current manifestation.
And Within our limited time today, we're going to provide a more complex and nuanced understanding of the colonial relationship in Canada to ground our perspective. The stages of colonization that we're going to address in our presentation were taken from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was a commission established in 1991, which included 178 days of public hearings and culminated in a final report with recommendations towards reestablishing a sustainable relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. So to begin, I'm going to read you a direct quote from RCAP that describes the purpose of the commission in the context of multicultural Canadian society. So Canada is a test case for a grand notion, the notion that dissimilar people can share lands, resources, power, and dreams while respecting and sustaining their differences. The story of Canada is a story of many such peoples trying and failing and trying again to live together in peace and harmony. But there cannot be peace or harmony unless there is justice. It was to help restore justice to the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada and to propose practical solutions to stubborn problems that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was established. So the RCAP begins by offering a historical perspective, and we are going to attempt to do the same in our limited time here. So to begin, Europeans have attempted to justify their sovereignty over Indigenous lands and people by citing what was then international law, the doctrine of discovery, or the principle of terra nullius, which refers to empty, barren land, was therefore open for taking. And the concept was expanded to include lands that were not possessed by quote-unquote civilized people or being used in civilized ways. This idea is both ethnocentric and contrary to historical evidence. So this exemplifies why it's problematic to look at Indigenous history as beginning with European contact. Rather, it is necessary to look at the history of Indigenous people and colonization by beginning in the period before contact. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People outlines Indigenous settler relationships in 4 stages: separate worlds, contact and cooperation, displacement and assimilation, and negotiation and renewal. So the first stage, separation, refers to how before the year approximately 1500, Europeans and Indigenous people in what would become Canada were divided by an ocean and each developed their unique political, economic, and cultural lifestyles. From the Indigenous perspective, this separation was caused by an act of creation. Most Indigenous nations believe that they have been living in what is now Canada for time immemorial, and that in many accounts of creation, transmitted through intergenerational oral history, the Creator gave people a distinct place and role to carry out on the land to each other and the Creator. So this stage ends when Europeans begin to travel across the ocean, ridding the physical gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
So during the next stage, there is increasing contact and cooperation. Indigenous peoples provided assistance in the way of food, traditional medicine, and sustainable knowledge of the environment to Europeans. And we want to make note here of the Two-Row Wampum Belt, which dictated the treaty relationship between the Iroquois Confederacy and settlers in 1613. The Indigenous reply to the initial proposal by the settlers was, "You say that you are our father and I am your son. We say, we will not be like father and son, but like brothers. Neither of us will make compulsory laws or interfere in the internal affairs of the other. Neither of us will try to steer the other one's vessel."
So during these initial stages of contact, Indigenous people had the upper hand in both numbers and wealth of knowledge about surviving in the environment. Trade relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people were important at this time. The fur trade quickly became one of the most important parts of what would become Canada's economy, which was when Indigenous people would hunt furs, specifically the beaver, and Europeans would trade goods like copper and iron and clothing and beads and alcohol, and then take the furs and sell them in Europe for high fashion purposes, which was very profitable. Military alliances were also important during this time, as the Canadian and American border was not yet set in stone, and large numbers of Indigenous people fought on the side of the British, later Canadians, and were instrumental in resisting northward American expansion. During this period, there were also incidences of violence, conflict, and prejudice against one another, but both Indigenous and non-Indigenous history documents a time of mutual cooperation. Social distance was maintained during this time, and political, cultural, and social differences of various nations were respected. During this time, however, Indigenous numbers were declining largely in part due to foreign diseases infecting the Indigenous population, to which they had no immunity, and settler colonies were increasing in population.
So in Canada, legislation has proven to be one of the most insidious practices by which the state has attempted to control Indigenous identity. The Indian Act of 1876 came at the peak of this period in colonial history. The dramatic shifting of population ratios and the decline of the fur trade undermined the more balanced, mutually beneficial relationship of early contact. The Indian Act represented the increasingly incompatible notions of economic development and understandings of land rights between the settler and Indigenous populations. Based originally on religious and philosophical grounds, the sense of cultural and moral superiority that would become more commonplace amongst settler opinion was justified by additional pseudoscientific theories developed during the 19th century, which rested ultimately on ethnocentric and racist premises. The paternalistic nature of this act sought to define who was and who was not recognized as a quote-unquote Indian. In fact, in the original glossary of the act, a person was defined as any individual other than an Indian. An Indian was a male of Indian blood, a child of an Indian, or a woman who was lawfully married to another Indian. The act also regulated and continues to regulate governance, land use, healthcare, education, and dictates how bands and reserves operate in Canada to this day. The joint government and church residential school program was the centerpiece of this assimilation strategy. The schools tore children away from their communities and placed them in substandard living arrangements, putting the physical health of these children at great risk. The curriculum administered at these schools directly attacked emotional, psychological, and spiritual health by severing intergenerational learning about Indigenous knowledge and punishing the use of Indigenous languages and any mention of traditional practices, ceremonies, or spirituality. In 1884, an amendment to the Act outright banned the potlatch ceremony of the West Coast Indigenous peoples. This ceremony, much more than a celebration, represented the ways in which West Coast Indigenous peoples understood economic status as the ability to transfer the most wealth onto others and maintain equality amongst the community. Power, then, came from one's ability to give away or even destroy material goods. A similar amendment in 1895 banned the sun dance of the Plains people and was not lifted until 1951. And to reinforce these laws, the Indian Act deemed that any Indian forming a congregation, that is, of more than 2 people, could be prosecuted for conspiring against the government. As mentioned, Indigenous women were disproportionately attacked by Indian Act policies that stated that any Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous person would lose their status and thus their right to live in their communities, let alone practice their traditional ceremonies. The same did not apply to Indigenous men, and in fact, non-Indigenous women who married Indigenous men could gain status and these benefits. The state recognized that by diminishing Indigenous women's relationships to their land, their knowledge, and their spirituality, they were also attacking Indigenous culture as a whole. These destructive policies link directly to the continued cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada.
The legacy of colonization did not end with the closing of the last residential school door in 1996. The Indian Act is still in force with amendments, and the intergenerational impacts have been devastating. When the international community began to assess the Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in Canada separately, it soon became clear that Indigenous people experience lower living standards when you look at nearly every development indicator possible. For example, in 2013, Canada ranked 8th on the Human Development Index, but when you looked at the same indicators for just the Indigenous population in Canada, we're at 63rd. The current socioeconomic status of Indigenous peoples in Canada is directly rooted in the colonial relationship. In the context of the rights-based approach, this forces us to question whether or not this framework adequately addresses the continued struggle of groups who have historically been considered non-human. With this in mind, it is also important to focus less on deficits and encourage strength-based solutions that decolonize our institutions and support Indigenous self-determination. Indigenous peoples fought and continue to foster incredible resilience amongst these attacks, but communities today are still navigating the severe repercussions concerning their spiritual rights. Some Indigenous elders still leave the room at the mention of spiritual practices because of deeply set internalized fear of legal repercussions for doing so. The process of decolonization is ongoing and requires a revival of commitment to relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that contextualizes Canada's present cultural environment with the acknowledgement of its historical underpinnings. Decolonization means acknowledging not just the ways in which Indigenous people helped settlers survive, but how they actively contributed to the political and economic development of Canada through a distinct and valuable worldview. So the final stage that we look at is the negotiation and renewal. So this stage takes us to present day and relies on non-Indigenous societies' admission of the failure of its assimilationist approach. To summarize the conclusion, or to quote the conclusion from the RCAP report, the main policy direction pursued for more than 150 years in Canada, first by colonial then by Canadian governments, has been wrong. This may seem straightforward, but it's crucial to note that this does not absolve current Canadian government or its policies. Both historic and current injustices to Indigenous people in Canada need to be addressed. Particularly the contemporary aspect of this is met with resistance. Following the Royal Proclamation on Aboriginal peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 and had a mandate to address the ongoing intergenerational trauma experienced by present-day Indigenous people, which continues to have a profound effect on the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The Commission concluded and released its findings earlier this year.
So as some of you may know, this year Canada has also held our 42nd federal election. And this saw a race between the conservative, liberal, New Democratic, and Green parties. Although our Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, had made a formal apology for the residential schools on behalf of the state in 2008, he declared this year that he would not commit to any of the 94 recommendations produced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Since I entered high school in 2006, Stephen Harper's conservative government has been the only one that I have known. Harper was also the Prime Minister who rejected the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, alongside the United States, Australia, and New Zealand in 2007. In fact, during his 10 years of office, Harper's government has made devastating cuts to Indigenous services that promote cultural revitalization, and has stated that missing and murdered Indigenous women are not a priority. So at this point, we will be expanding our dialogue of sustainable reconciliation beyond the more narrowly defined dichotomy of settlers and Indigenous peoples, and strive to address the dissonance between more recent narratives of multiculturalism and immigration in Canada. As you may or may not know, one of the major and unprecedented hot-button issues during our election this year involved the banning of the niqab during citizenship oath ceremonies. In 2008, a woman named Zunera Ishak arrived in Canada. She was approved for citizenship in 2013, but was not offered accommodations to remove her niqab in the presence of female government employees. And this ban was actually introduced by Jason Kenney, the former Minister of National Defense and Multiculturalism. So Ishak subsequently challenged the ban in courts. On February 6, 2015, the Ishak versus Canada case was brought before the Federal Court of Canada, with Judge Keith Boswell ruling that the niqab ban was unlawful. In response, Prime Minister Harper stated that wearing the niqab during the citizenship oath was offensive and not how we do things here. Last month, on October 5th, the Federal Court of Appeal dismissed the government's request to stay the decision, while the Harper government waits to see if the Supreme Court of Canada will hear an appeal. Meanwhile, on October 9th, Ishak took her citizenship oath wearing her niqab, just in time to vote in the election on October 19th. So the issue went beyond this case, however, and actually directly contributed to the waning of support for the New Democratic Party in Quebec in favor of the Conservatives. So the support for the NDP evaporated soon after the party leader Tom Mulcair declared his opposition to the ban of the niqab. And the niqab ban might have directly affected only a few number of Canadians, but the debate has been very unsettling for the many who view Canada as a tolerant and multicultural society. In the words of Zunera Ishak, based on what she heard from friends in her English literature courses, she believed her new home would be a bastion of freedom and tolerance.
So Indigenous women have responded to this election issue by launching the #DoIMatterNow campaign on social media to promote their solidarity and highlight their frustration with Harper's insistence on attacking the religious freedoms of migrant women, while at the same time he continues to dismiss the protection of Indigenous women and the legacy of the government's attacks on Indigenous culture and spirituality. These two attacks taking place in the same country, ultimately marginalizing and attacking the human rights of two subgroups of women, which, as evidence, opens them up to many forms of violence. Another narrative that emerged surrounding the niqab issue was sort of put forth by the pro-niqab ban proponents, was that they were concerned that by allowing, in this case, Muslim people to wear the niqab during citizenship ceremonies would erode, quote-unquote, Canadian culture, and like Canadian culture would experience the same thing that Canadian culture did to Indigenous people. And this, of course, was met with backlash from Indigenous activists who argued that it was completely inappropriate to use our history of colonial violence as a tool to further their racist arguments. So these two communities, in this case Muslim and Indigenous, while ultimately seeking justice, were looking for different responses from the government and society. Muslim women were seeking citizenship, religious freedom, and freedom to dress how they choose, while Indigenous women are seeking state engagement with our communities regarding gender-based violence. These two different goals don't have to limit opportunities for solidarity. Solidarity must work to further the causes of a marginalized community, and this example shows how community struggles can be addressed by all.
So in conclusion, multicultural ideals in Canada have not produced a neutral political ground for meaningful and productive dialogue about spiritual and religious diversity in Canada. This is not surprising when we consider how this manifestation of multiculturalism has failed to address the colonial legacy and the asymmetrical power dynamics that actually form the basis of current societal relations between cultural groups in Canada. In terms of allyship, the MDP program at the University of Winnipeg has offered Sarah and I the opportunity to work together to address serious issues in Canada through our own lived experiences of what it means to live in the Canadian state. The lessons that we have learned inside and outside our classroom culminate in the understanding that the way forward is to promote a framework of allyship that is rooted in the worldview of the marginalized. In Canada, this is complicated by intersectional discourses of marginalized people as a result of a long colonial history and more recent immigration. The cultural mosaic is indeed a deeply fractured national narrative, and it is one that does not need to be put back together, but completely dismantled and reworked to better reflect an accurate understanding of the successes and issues that arise every single day in our country through and despite conflict. We believe that the Canadian state needs to more honestly position itself within its own borders and subsequently within the international community if our leaders are going to continue to have an influential role, as there's a lot to be learned and contributed when we complicate cultural relations within our country. And if you hadn't heard, Stephen Harper did not win another election. And our new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is in Turkey right now at the G20 conference in Antalya. Thank you so much for listening to us.